It's the amazing Rico Brogna podcast with your host, Evan Roberts.
Hello there, everybody. Welcome to a brand spanking new edition of Rico Brogna. Believe it or not, we are at episode 401. What losers we are. I'm just kidding. Or maybe I'm not. Thank you very much for listening and downloading. If you haven't subscribed to the Rico Brogna, I was explaining this actually to my mom and dad the other day because my dad was like, what do you just do Ricos randomly? How do I know if there's a Rico Brogna? And I said, well, Dad, if you subscribe to the Rico Brogna, wherever you download your podcast, it'll just pop up. So even if we do a surprise Rico Brogna, which we do plenty of, it'll just show up right there and you'll never miss it, right? So it's all nice and organized. We try to do Rico Brognas guaranteed every Wednesday and every Sunday. And obviously over the last few months, we've mixed in a lot of extra bonus Ricos. Usually when we do our Sunday Rico, we do it at night. We did a little change on this Sunday morning if you're watching live on YouTube or you downloaded it immediately, because quite frankly, I'm hitting the road later today. I'm driving all the way down to North Carolina. So if there's breaking news, watch out. Actually, believe it or not, last year at this time, there was breaking news as I was in the car with my family driving down, not to North Carolina, but to Disney World. And that was when Yoshinobu Yamamoto picked the team and signed with the Dodgers. And we actually did a driving through North Carolina Rico reacting to the Yamamoto signing. You can check out the archives for that one. But we got a lot to get to today. The first base market we will touch on. The Phillies making a significant trade in the National League East. And also, by the end of this episode, we are going to pick the rewatch game for Rico Brogna. We always have an old game that we rewatch or maybe watch for the first time if you haven't seen it. Before this episode is done, the game will be selected. So if you have time during these Christmas and Hanukkah holidays, you can join us and rewatch the selected game. But let me start off by tributing the great Ricky Henderson. When that news came out on Saturday, I think all of us were just stunned. In fact, the first time I saw it, it was on social media, and it looked like it was an internet rumor. And unfortunately, you get a lot of that on social media where there's a story about someone dying, and you're like, that's not true. And then it turns out not to be true. So when I first read that we had lost Ricky Henderson, I thought it was fake. And then when it was obviously confirmed by people we trust, like everyone else, my stomach dropped. And I think that the main reason why it was so depressing was not how great he was not my personal memories of him in 99 with the Mets, or even your personal memories as the stolen base king with Oakland or the Yankees or wherever he was. What killed me was his age. Like, he's 65. It's too young. And so my obsession, I'll say to my wife, was, how did he pass? Like, was he sick? Did we not know? And the only thing I read is that he was battling pneumonia. So your heart breaks, my heart breaks. I think we all do for the Henderson family. As far as Ricky as a player is concerned, he's one of those guys. I call him a bridge guy for me personally. I'm 41 years old. So when I'm learning baseball and I'm starting to understand baseball in the early 90s, Ricky's already there. He's already established. So as my dad is teaching me everything about this sport, one of the first things he tells me and teaches me is the greatness of Ricky Henderson. And I think we all have players like that where you didn't see their entire career just based on your age, but you start learning baseball and that guy's already there. And I think what my dad told me about Ricky Henderson was simply, and you can't argue with this, that's the greatest leadoff hitter we've ever seen. And I don't think there's any debate. Obviously, we as Met fans were privileged in 1999 to have him on the team. And what's so amazing thinking about that 1.5 years he was here, I choose to forget 2000 because I don't know how many people remember this, but Ricky did not play well in 2000. And me and my dad were at a game. For some reason, I think it was against the Marlins, but you may have to fact check me. He hits a ball off the left field fence and does his home run trot and ends up stopping at first base, and the crowd boos the daylights out of him. One of the rare times as a non-booer that I was urged to boo because Ricky wasn't hitting, and it's like, Ricky, how are you only on first base? And I think the next day was also one of the rare times where me and my dad made a sign. Didn't make a lot of signs back then, or really ever. And I think the sign was, next time run or something like that. We were mocking the great Ricky Henderson. And within days of that, he got DFA'd. And that was the end of his Met run, early 2000. You almost forget he was on the Mets in 2000. But 1999, he was such a privilege to watch. He was a privilege to watch because, A, he had a great year, very underrated great year in Ricky's career. Because, look, the guy's an MVP. The guy had 100 stolen base seasons. No one's going to argue that 1999 was one of his best years. But look this up. He had 315 that year. That's the third highest batting average he had in any season in his major league career. So while he wasn't prime Ricky, he was 40 at the time. He had a great year. The Mets are not a playoff team without Ricky Henderson. So not only do we get to watch selfishly this future Hall of Famer show us some of his greatness, the other thing Ricky Henderson did, and I do not believe this is a coincidence at all, is he taught Roger Cedeno how to be a baseball player. And he taught Roger Cedeno how to steal bases, because that was the same year that Roger Cedeno set the then single-season stolen base record in New York Met history. And I do not think it was a surprise that his teammate was Ricky Henderson. I think Ricky contributed to that, and he was obviously a big part of that very special 1999 team that got all the way to the NLCS. I'm not going to leave out the poker game that him and Bobby Bonilla supposedly played during Game 6 of the NLCS, but that was typical of Ricky. There was some good, there was some bad. But it was, as a Met fan, an honor to get to watch him play baseball, even for just that year and a half. And obviously, as a baseball fan and knowing what he accomplished in Oakland, what he accomplished with the Yankees, let's see if I can name every team. San Diego, Toronto, the Angels, the Dodgers, the Mets. I mean, he bounced around at the end, but heartbreaking to hear news like that. R.I.P. to the great Ricky Henderson, one of the great ball players we've ever seen in all of our lives. As far as the baseball is concerned, so over the last few days, we've had some interesting developments. The New York Yankees took my backup plan. A few days ago here on the Rico, I suggested that if the Mets don't re-sign Pete Alonso, their best course of action would be to sign Paul Goldschmidt on a one-year contract, which is exactly what the Yankees did. And we'll see how he fares in the Bronx. I think he has a really good chance to have a bounce-back year. But the key was backup plan. I want Pete Alonso back. And as you watch this market over the last 3 days, go through everything that's happened. Christian Walker signs a 3-year, $60 million contract with the Astros. We know the deal with Walker. Coming off a very good year last year. All-world defensively, Gold Glover. But he's a little bit older than Pete. 3.5 years older than Pete Alonso. He only gets $20 million a year, and he's coming off a year that was probably better than Pete's, at least statistically. Paul Goldschmidt, coming off an awful season, even though he did pick it up late and mash lefties, signs a 1-year, $12.5 million contract. Carlos Santana signs basically the same deal, 1 year, $12 million to go back to Cleveland. That's because Cleveland trades Josh Naylor for nothing. I mean, the Guardians traded Naylor for a pitcher who's not even that big of a prospect. So it's not just the money, it's the prospect capital that it even cost to acquire a guy like Josh Naylor, coming off a pretty good year, still relatively young. He's only 28 years old, but obviously is a free agent at the end of the year. So all of us as Met fans see this, and there's two thoughts you could have. Thought number one is, what is this going to do to Pete's market? Here's why I'm not as confident as everybody else, because I think a lot of Met fans have seen this and said, oh, God, no one's interested in Alonso. He's going to have to crawl back. He's going to get nothing. There are still, I'll name two teams right off the top, two teams not affected by any of these moves that I think will still be interested in Pete Alonso. And all you need is one team to say, I want the player, and I'm going to give more than what Houston gave Christian Walker, and kind of break the market a little bit. And those two teams I am afraid of are the Washington Nationals and the Chicago Cubs. I get it. The Astros are out. Okay, fine. The Guardians were never a factor here. The Yankees were never a factor here. The Yankees were never going hard after Pete Alonso. That wasn't a thing. So the competition hasn't been eliminated, because I still think the Chicago Cubs are interested in Pete Alonso. We heard that all the way back in the summer. I think the Nationals are still interested in Pete Alonso. And all it takes is one offer and one dumb owner, if you want to call it that, to give Pete more than what this market is dictating. Now, the other thing is, and this is kind of like educated speculation, if Pete Alonso is going to take back his best offer to the New York Mets, and the Mets have basically told him, hey, shop yourself, see what you can get, and then come back to us. And we'd love to have you back, but we offered you something 2 years ago. Granted, it was a different administration. It wasn't David Stearns making the offer, which we should keep in mind. But go out, get the best you can, and then come back to us. That also may be a thing that's kind of hurting the market for Pete, because if you're the Washington Nationals or you're the Chicago Cubs or you're whatever team that may be surprisingly interested in Pete Alonso, and you hear that the Mets are basically saying, look, just bring it back to us, we'll match whatever's out there, why would you even make an offer? Your attitude can be, they're just going to match it, they're just going to beat it, why waste our time? If that's the case, by the way, that's beautiful on David Stearns' part. Bring his market down. So we're speculating because that's all we're doing on this. Hey, what does this do to Pete's market? Is this going to force Pete to sign before Christmas? I stand by the fact that I think Alonso and Boris are going to be so bullheaded that they're going to drag this thing out to February. What I feared in February has already happened, which is the backup plans are gone. Getting Santana or Goldie on a one-year deal was a fine backup plan, because what it did was it gave you production for this year, not as good as Pete, in my opinion, but production for this year, and then kept you in a spot where next year you can go hard after Vlad Guerrero Jr., or you can go after Murakami coming over from Japan. So what is the backup plan if they don't re-sign Pete Alonso? What is the backup plan if Pete just gets bitter with this and says, screw you guys, I want to leave, which I know no Met fan wants to believe could happen. Or, again, one owner makes an offer to Pete that David Stern says, I'm not doing it. The other thing that you wonder about with the Mets, and I've asked this question a lot about their thought on Pete, is what is their line in the sand? What's that amount of money or years where they say we can't go past that? Is it 4 years? Is it 3 years? I don't think it's the amount of money per year. I don't think it's money. I think it's years. What is that line in the sand? And then the other question is, are they slow playing this, thinking we only want to give him a one-year deal because we want to go after Vladimir Guerrero Jr. a year from now? Is that what's going on in David Stearns' mind and Steve Cohen's mind? But right now, the market for first baseman, there's no denying it, has been very, very cold. The backup plans are basically coming off the board, unless you're interested in Anthony Rizzo. Give me a freaking break. And so when does Pete Alonso and Scott Boras say, screw it, let's find a home? And I certainly hope it's the Mets. I have made that clear over and over again. I know that there are some arguments that we've had, fellow Met fans, on the value of Pete Alonso and how good Pete Alonso is, and if there's a concern about him declining. Look, I want this guy back. If they end up getting him on a short-term deal, fine, whatever. If they get him on a 3-year opt-out after one kind of year deal, great. At this point, I want him back on this team. I'm not giving him a 5-year deal. Though I admit, if all of a sudden the Nationals get desperate and they offered him a 5-year deal and now Scott comes back to the Mets and it's either match it or he's gone, this is why I'd be a terrible general manager, because I'd probably match it. The other kind of floating impact here on the Pete Alonso sweepstakes is Alex Bregman. Are the New York Mets seriously interested in Alex Bregman? Their name has been connected to Bregman now in numerous reports over the last few days. And one thing we know about Bregman is that he's not going back to the Houston Astros. The Astros have clearly moved on from him. They've brought in a first baseman in Christian Walker. They brought in a guy who could have been the first baseman, but is now going to be the third baseman in Isaac Paredes, who, by the way, is going to have a monster year in Houston. Just write that one down. That's a long-term 2025 prediction. So the Astros are done. So the idea of, hey, he may take less to go back to Houston ain't happening. So now you look around the league and you say, all right, if the Astros are out, who's going after Alex Bregman? Two teams that have been mentioned a lot, the Detroit Tigers, and I think it makes a lot of sense for the Tigers. When you have a surprise year like Detroit had last year, you can't just rest on your laurels. You got to go for it. You got to be aggressive. And along with locking up Tariq Skubal, who they should, or at least try to, bringing in a guy like Alex Bregman, I commend them if they're able to pull that off. The Boston Red Sox, look, The Red Sox have been involved in all these big free agent names. They missed out on Soto. They make the big trade for Garrett Crochet. They could move Devers to first base. I get it for them too. I have made the argument on WFAN about the Yankees going after Alex Bregman. I've made my point on why it makes sense for them. I don't think they're going to. So my opinion, separate from what I think the Yankees are going to do. So you've got Boston, you've got Detroit. I think they're absolutely legitimate candidates to sign Bregman. And the Mets' name continues to be mentioned. So I've got two theories on this. Number one, they're not really interested. This is a Scott Boras, hey, let me connect the Mets because there aren't a lot of teams going after Bregman right now. I want to get him $200 million. If I can get New York involved, maybe that ups the price a little bit. I don't know if it's going to work. I don't think it's going to work, but that's one theory I have. And then number two is the Mets would replace Pete Alonso with Alex Bregman. And in doing so, still allow themselves the flexibility of getting Vladimir Guerrero Jr. 1 year from now. Here's the thing I don't believe. And I admit I'd love to be wrong. The idea that the Mets could sign Alex Bregman and still sign Pete Alonso. I find it very, very hard to believe, and I will lay out the reasons why. Okay? Now, my wife will tell you this. I'm driving to Brooklyn last night, Saturday night. Me, my family, some friends had a great night out watching the Nets lose to the Utah Jazz, right? In a luxury suite. It was a bougie kind of night. And as we're there, I hear a text message from my Mets chat. And so what I do normally when I'm driving is I hand my phone to my wife and I say, can you reveal what was just said in this Mets text chat? And my wife reveals to me an exchange between Michael Mayer, does a very good job covering the Mets, I trust him, and a fan in which a fan says, hey, if the Mets are interested in Alex Bregman, would they still go after Pete Alonso? And his answer was, yeah. So as this happens, my wife's like, what does this mean? Is Pete coming back, hon? I said, well, I just don't believe that the Mets would sign Bregman to a 6 or 7 year contract at 31 years old and then also keep Pete. I think the only way that happens is if Pete settles on a 1 or 2 year deal. So that's how it could happen. But even if it did, walk through the positions on how the Mets would line this thing up. And I did create a Met lineup in front of my wife. I said, hey, let me just put this Met lineup together that features Alex Bregman and Pete Alonso. And let me tell you, it's a loaded lineup. Like, the Mets right now with this rotation, which we'll get into in a few minutes, is not good enough. You know, they're going to need a million things to break right to pitch well enough to get back to the postseason, dare I say, win this division. More on that in a little bit. But man, oh man, if you had this lineup, you could score more runs than any team in baseball and maybe overcome a mediocre pitching staff. So I'm envisioning it, but then I'm thinking, all right, if you sign Alex Bregman, you're basically going to tell Mark Vientos, here are your two options. Mark Vientos is your full-time DH. Are you really doing that in his second full year in his major league career in which he's already shown great progress defensively at third base? Are you already throwing in the towel on Vientos as a defensive player? And you're probably doing it maybe for multiple years if you brought Pete back on a multi-year deal. If you bring Pete back on a 1 year deal, then okay, maybe it's a 1 year kind of test drive and we'll see what happens. But you're committing to Bregman for 6 or 7 years because he's not accepting a contract that's going to be less than that. You're telling me Bregman takes a 1 year deal. It's a different discussion. That's not happening. So number one, I have a tough time imagining that the Mets, as much as you out there may say, just do it, Evan, what's the problem? I can't imagine, based on everything David Stearns has said, that they're going to take Mark Vientos and tell him, hey, you're a full-time DH this early in his major league career. And also, and I will argue this with anybody, he showed progress at third base last year. He was not a butcher. I've seen worse. Put it that way. We've all seen worse. Howard Johnson would like a word. You know what I mean? So option number one, if you somehow pulled this off of bringing in Bregman and re-signing Pete, is Vientos is your DH. Option number one, I find very unlikely. Option number two is you telling Pete Alonso, you're the DH. And as much as Pete is having a tough offseason, I know a few things about Pete Alonso. He wants to play first base. The idea of DHing even 3 times in a year kind of annoys him. Now, would I increase that number as time goes on? Of course, I would increase that number on everybody. I'd increase that number on Juan Soto. I'd increase that number on Lindor. If I brought in Bregman, same thing, because DH can be used as a nice little half and off day. And as guys are starting to get older, I think it's a great way to keep them fresh. And we didn't see a lot of that last year. We did not see DH days out of Pete Alonso and Francisco Lindor. I would as time goes on. Now, eventually, guys are going to become full-time DHs. Juan Soto certainly will be that at some point. Hopefully, it's not 3 years from now. Hopefully, it's, let's say, year 9 of this 15-year contract, though that may be a little aggressive. But I don't see a scenario where Pete Alonso is pushed off to DHing while Mark Vientos plays the bulk of the time at first base. I don't even see a share job. The other option, which I also find peculiar, is that early in this offseason, Alex Bregman had been linked to the idea of moving off of third base and playing second base. And when you look at Bregman's size and you look at his great defensive abilities, I don't think there's any doubt he can move to second base and be very successful. No question in my mind. You move him to second base, I think he'll be fine. What I'm curious about and very skeptical about is, are you really going to take a Gold Glove winning third baseman and move him to second base for Mark Vientos, who, while, like I said, has been much better defensively and has improved and maybe gets even better, because he's also one of those guys you can tell works his butt off. So could he get even better this year? Could he develop himself into like a borderline Gold Glove defensive third baseman? Before you laugh about that, Wade Boggs. Wade Boggs was a butcher defensively at third base. He worked his butt off. He ended up becoming pretty solid. So I'll always give a young player who works his butt off the opportunity to get better. But are you really going to move Alex Bregman to second base this early in his career? The best option, if you actually pull this off, if somehow the Mets decide, you know what, we got Bregman on a good contract, we didn't have to give him a 7th year, we gave him a 6th year, we got Pete back on a shortish term deal, and we pulled it off. And now the Mets have this insanely loaded lineup. I mean, this lineup would be ridiculous. And you'd give yourself great flexibility to trade, let's say, Luis Angel Acuna, maybe more flexibility to do that after signing these multiple guys as opposed to before. I would probably err on the side of Bregman plays some second base. Bregman plays a lot of third base. Vientos does some DHing. Alonso does some DHing. Mets talk about flexibility. I would try to make that as flexible as possible. So yes, there would be days in which the DH spot is open because Alex Bregman is at second base and Mark Vientos is at third. That allows a day for Juan Soto to DH. That allows a day for Francisco Lindor to DH. And then there are other days in which Pete is DHing and Vientos is at first base, or days in which Vientos is DHing and Bregman's at third base. With all that said, we can lay out the scenario all we want. I find it very hard to believe. I really do. I find it very hard to believe that the Mets are going to use the assets, the financial assets that they have, and they still have a lot of wiggle room before they get back to the Cohen tax, and certainly before they get back to their payroll from last year. I just find it really hard to believe that with the long-term commitment to Brandon Nimmo, Francisco Lindor, and Juan Soto, that they're going to throw in another long commitment to Alex Bregman and potentially Pete Alonso. But we shall see. I'll tell you right now, if they sign Bregman tomorrow, our reaction is going to be, I'm going to be confused. Because if this is Bregman versus Alonso, it's a straight line debate on who's the better player moving forward, and really, was it worth it? But if you're going to keep open to the idea that you can get Bregman and P2, horse of a different color. The other thing is, if they are not going to improve this rotation with some certainty, which they have not done, and I'm not ruling it out, it is still the latter part of December, and there are still arms out there. Corbin Burns hasn't signed, despite the Mets not being linked to him. Luis Castillo hasn't been traded. Dylan Cease hasn't been traded. Like, there are still options out there. But if the Mets are going to have this kind of questionable rotation, their formula, and we talked about this last year, is going to be to mash. It's going to be to score a ton of runs. Not top 5, not top 7, top 2. They're going to have to do that to be successful. And right now, their lineup has holes. If you brought in Bregman and Alonso, let me just give you the lineup real quick. Because I did this on the way to the Nets game, so let's all do it together. Imagine this lineup, okay? I want you to picture it. Let's picture it very briefly. Leading off, the shortstop, Francisco Lindor. Batting second, first baseman, Pete Alonso. Batting third, right fielder, Juan Soto. Batting cleanup, third baseman, batting cleanup, third baseman, Mark Vientos. Batting fifth, second baseman, Alex Bregman. Batting sixth, left fielder, Brandon Nimmo. Batting seventh, the catcher, Francisco Alvarez. Batting eighth, your DH, let's say Brett Beatty, Starling Marte, Jesse Winker. Batting ninth, your defensive first center fielder for now, Jose Siri versus Tyrone Taylor, or maybe eventually Jet Williams. That's a loaded lineup. That is a lineup that's scoring you 5 runs per game, maybe more. So I guess we could fantasize about that, but I am very skeptical that all that can be pulled off. Now let's get to the starting pitching situation. So a couple of things. Number one, on Sunday morning, the Philadelphia Phillies of all teams acquired Jesus Luzardo from the Miami Marlins. What I like to do with these trades is say, all right, this is what they gave up. What's our equivalent? Now, this is not apples to apples. I understand that, but I do want to give you perspective. The Phillies traded their 4th best prospect and their 23rd best prospect for Jesus Luzardo. As of right now, the Mets' 4th best prospect is Ryan Clifford. Highly regarded prospect. I also think the Mets have a higher ranked system than the Philadelphia Phillies. That's why it is never apples to apples. But would you have been comfortable trading a toppish prospect like Ryan Clifford in a package for Jesus Luzardo? We talked a lot about Jesus Luzardo potentially being an option. Some of the appealing things about him is his youth. The fact that he's still young and maybe the best is yet to come. With Luzardo, I think the negative was the season he had last year. He did not have a tremendous year a year ago, but he's young. He has a high upside. I know what David Stearns really likes, and that is the fact that he's still cheap. He is under team control this year. He is under team control next year. But last year for the Marlins, he missed half the year, and when he pitched to a 5 ERA. So if the Mets trade for Luzardo, if they had traded for Luzardo, there would have been a lot of, hey, this could be good. But he would also be a question like the rest of the rotation. You know, just because he's not a Met and he's going to Philadelphia doesn't mean we should hype him up differently than what he actually is. He's a guy who has great potential, has shown us that, especially 2 years ago when he made 32 starts and pitched to a mid-3 ERA. But last year, he didn't pitch. And when he did, he wasn't good. So he would have joined the rotation that features a lot of uncertainty. And what I have been stressing is that what I need the Mets to do, what I want the Mets to do, while ideally it's add an ace, but it's add someone who you feel pretty damn good about based on their track record is going to give you 180 innings. Dylan Cease is the definition of that. Luis Castillo is the definition of that. Do I think both guys are true aces? At least the way I define aces? Not really. I wouldn't say that. But they give you a form of stability. And right now, as we've talked about a lot, the Mets have none of that. Their rotation features, their number one, as of now, a guy who made 1 start last year in Kodai Senga. Their number 2, very encouraging year from David Peterson, we'd all agree, but did it only for half a season. Then you've got converted reliever Clay Holmes, project Frankie Montas, and a bunch of swing options that you hope maybe you hit on one of them. Guys like Griffin Canning, guys like Jose Buto, guys like Tyler McGill and Paul Blackburn. It is a rotation that is filled with questions, and what they need to do, and I'm not freaking out about it because it is late December. And one thing I've learned is to give David Stearns a level of trust. Now, where I'm not going to fully trust him is the idea that he could put any starting pitcher in this rotation, and don't worry, the Met lab will fix them. He had a great year last year with that, but it is naive for me or anyone to think, oh, don't worry, Montas, he's going to be Severino from last year. Like, that takes a lot of faith. He did it 1 year, and it wasn't all hits. Adrian Hauser wasn't exactly a hit. And I think Minaya and Severino, as the lottery tickets that worked last year, have better resumes than the guys you're trying to hit with this year. Doesn't mean they can't be successful. Just means I can't sit here and be honest with you and say, oh, I've got full faith. Don't worry. This rotation's loaded. I can't do that. But here's where I do trust David Stearns. I trust him that the offseason isn't over. I trust him that David Stearns is waiting for the right time to jump. I trust him that whether it's a trade we don't see coming, or maybe it's the market on a starting pitcher changing that we don't see coming, I believe that he knows it ain't over and he will strike. So I've had arguments with non-Met fans about the Met rotation. This rotation stinks. They're not good enough to make the playoffs. David Stearns is getting too cocky. What I say to them, and the same thing I'll say to my fellow Met fan, is it is not fair to judge the rotation right now. If I was judging it right now, would I be the first to tell you it's not good enough? Yeah, it's not good enough. You're banking on a lot of surprises and a lot of things we don't see coming. Could happen, sure. It's baseball season, you never know. But I would not be able to passionately and I guess honestly debate that this rotation is good enough. Look at the Philly rotation. I mean, it's not even in the same league. Zach Wheeler, Aaron Nola, Ranger Suarez, Jesus Luzardo, Christopher Sanchez. Are you kidding me? Not even close. Not even close. But if you downloaded this podcast prior to Christmas, you would know it's not Christmas. And because of that, I am willing and open to give him more time to strike. And one of the guys he's going to strike on, or at least try to strike on, is Roki Sasaki. And the good news with Roki Sasaki is that Roki Sasaki is at the stage where he is meeting with teams. Now, for those that are not familiar with these negotiations, this is not a highest bidder situation. You have to use your international bonus pool money, which is capped out. So the decision Sasaki is making is just literally the organization he wants to be a part of for the next 5-6 years. That's his decision. And while we heard from his agent at the winter meetings that he may not love dealing with the media, and that could certainly be a red flag for a big market team, there are layers to this process. Process one is show you're interested and send a care package, a pamphlet, if you will, a video to say, come here, please. It's like college recruiting. It's like recruiting LeBron when he was a free agent a decade and a half ago. Hopefully the Mets are not sending Donnie Walsh. But the New York Mets and the New York Yankees, to their credit, have qualified to the second round. They got a live in-person meeting with Roki Sasaki. You know who didn't get an in-person meeting? The team that was forced to trade their fourth best prospect for Jesus Luzardo and his 5 ERA, the Philadelphia Phillies. So there are small victories in life, and one of the victories the Mets have is they are getting to meet with Roki Sasaki. Are they going to get him? I don't know. I don't know how anyone would know. If they do get him, it would at least give us the confidence, not necessarily in the short term, but certainly in the long term of, wow, the Mets have this ace-capable, cheap, young arm under team control for the next 6 years. And God knows David Stearns doesn't want to pay starters. So the fact that you're going to have a guy making no money for 6 years is the ultimate. This would change, in my opinion, the complexion of this offseason. Not that this is a bad offseason. They added Juan Soto. But there is some trepidation and disappointment for what I talked about with what they've done in this rotation. If you add, even though it's a question, and even though you never know what he's going to do, especially in year one, but if you add ace potential at 24 years old and you're paying him nothing, I think that certainly creates a lot of excitement. I don't know what to expect from Roki Sasaki in year one, but if you're the New York Mets, you do everything you can to make this happen because there's no risk. Like when you sign Yamamoto, there's a risk. What if he stinks? You're wasting $35 million a year. A guy like Sasaki, the risk is very, very limited. So we'll see if the Mets can pull this off. We will get an answer in about 3 weeks, I guess, between January 10th and January 15th. That's kind of in that time frame around there, 12th to the 15th, 12th to the 16th, something like that. He will make a decision. He will sign. I'm not brimming with confidence it's going to be the Mets, but at least they've got a seat at the table. Question is, are they going to be the head of the table? But I do want to warn my fellow Met fans on two things. When it comes to Alonso and when it comes to adding a pitcher, it may take a while. And that doesn't mean it's not going to happen. It's different, but I'll bring it up anyway. I screamed on this podcast on the Rico Brogna for months, get me one bat. Get me one bat. And they did not add that bat until the very end of spring training when they signed J.D. Martinez. I'm not saying Alonso is signing at the end of spring training, and I certainly don't think they're acquiring a starting pitcher at the end of spring training. But what we have to remind ourselves, as impatient as we are, is you have to give the offseason time. It is late December. It's been a very active offseason. There's been a lot going on. It has not been your typical watching paint dry MLB offseason, even though as Met fans, maybe it feels that way after the Juan Soto signing. But you do have to give it just a little bit of time. Just a little bit. Just a little bit of time. All right, let me get to some of your emails. You can always email us to ricob@gmail.com. A great question was asked regarding a six-man rotation. Matt wrote this email, and I think it's certainly thought-provoking because David Stearns has already confirmed that the Mets are going to have a six-man rotation. So right now, when you see who's there and you see the swing options, you're always doing the math, and you're saying, all right, well, we need six guys. And right now, the Mets have four locks. They don't have six locks. So you could argue they could add two starting pitchers or maybe just one and then take one from the group of swing arms. Here's what Matt writes. Evan and Pete, first time, long time. Love the pod. The night of Johan's no-hitter, I tweeted you asking what would open the midday show the next day, and you replied, it's a highlight of mine. Believe it or not, it wasn't the midday show, technically. That was a Friday night, and I was doing my Saturday show, which was the same time as the midday show. And it was kind of like a midday show. And I'll never forget about that Saturday after the Johan no-hitter is I had two special guests, Joe Beningo, of course, and Doc Gooden. Doc came on to talk about his emotions of seeing a Met pitch a no-hitter. But thank you for that tweet, Matt. I appreciate it. That was a time in which I was better at responding to tweets. I am terrible at that now, but I'm glad I was able to give you a good memory a decade ago. Matt goes on to write, the Mets are clearly going to go to a six-man rotation, which does make sense. This will force them to carry one less in the bullpen all season compared to most teams. If they can't get length out of their starters, which is unlikely they will, how does being a man short impact them? Guys like Budo, McGill, and Nunez can give multiple innings, but it may be too much to ask for an entire season of 5+ innings out of starting six. Does this change the type of reliever they should be targeting, or does it just mean a long summer for Syracuse to City and the shuttle? LGM Matt, P.S. re-signing Pete is a must. Well, obviously, I agree with the last part. That is a great question. Really good question, because you're 100% right. We have caps now in Major League Baseball. You cannot carry more than 13 pitchers. So if you have a six-man rotation, you have a seven-man bullpen. Most teams have eight-man bullpens. I think your answer is probably what they're going to do. So right now, the Mets have added basically nobody to their bullpen. Or have they? Because the only additions the Mets have made, I'm talking about major league additions, has been swing starting pitchers. Guy like Griffin Canning, who's not guaranteed to be in the rotation. What I think this puts the Mets in a spot to do is McGill, Budo, Canning. Let's say those three guys do not make the rotation. Let's say Paul Blackburn starts off as the swing guy, and the Mets add another starting pitcher. Sean Manaea, Walker Buehler, whoever you want. That allows you Budo, bullpen, McGill, even though he has options, bullpen, Griffin Canning, bullpen. Those are three guys who can give you 2-3 innings. And that's, I think, how they handle it. You're right about the shuttle. Obviously, teams, until rules changes, are going to take advantage of the fact that you send the guy down, you call the guy up, you send the guy down, as long as they have options. It's something every team does. But I think their bullpen is going to be built with multiple guys who are basically starting pitchers pitching out of the bullpen. So on a day in which, name the start, like Clay Holmes goes 3 innings, Throws a ton of pitches. There's a lot of traffic on the base paths. Still a close game, by the way. Like, he goes 3 2/3 innings, allows 3 runs, but he throws a million pitches, and you have to go to the bullpen. I think Jose Budo comes in and tries to get you 9 outs. Griffin Canning potentially comes in and tries to get you 9 outs. So I think their bullpen, and when we get closer to spring training and we have a better idea of their options, like it is a finished slate in terms of the offseason, when we start to build the bullpen and figure, okay, who are going to be the names out there, and there's only 7 because you have a 6-man rotation, I think there's a really good chance that 2 or 3 of them are longish relievers. But you are right. That is an impact. And that leads me to something fascinating that's going on in the world of Major League Baseball right now that does not impact the Mets, but could impact the Mets. And that is the curious case of Michael Lorenzen. So we all know Michael Lorenzen, right? He's got big muscles. Pitch for the Phillies. He's bounced around baseball right now. Back in the day, was with Cincinnati. Early on, if you remember him in Cincinnati, Michael Lorenzen was actually a pretty good hitter. He hit a little bit. And at times, the Reds would use him where he would play a little bit in the outfield and would actually be a pinch hitter back in the days where pitchers would hit. So Michael Lorenzen was a 2-ish way player. I wouldn't say a 2-way player. I'd say 2-ish because he was a pitcher, but he would also get at-bats and be productive. That stopped once the DH became universal. Michael Lorenzen has had 1 plate appearance since 2021. His agent is trying to create the Michael Lorenzen cheat code, which, by the way, would benefit the New York Mets based on the discussion we just had. So here's the plan if you haven't heard this. This is so fascinating to me. His agent would have Michael Lorenzen sign with a rebuilding team. Let's just say the Chicago White Sox, because they are the definition of a rebuilding team. That team would play Michael Lorenzen in the outfield at DH and get him at bats. Because as soon as he gets, I think the rule is 20 games played, 3 plate appearances in each game. So you do this for the month, Michael Lorenzen would then qualify as a 2-way player. Right now, there's only 1 2-way player in Major League Baseball. You know who he is. It's Shohei Ohtani. Once he qualifies as a 2-way player, a team, let's say the Mets, would want to trade for him because that's your cheat code to having 14 pitchers on your roster. He would not count as one of the 13 pitchers. So this plan, this game plan that Lorenzen and his agent have, which I think is brilliant. If you have a team willing to do it, and if I'm a rebuilding team, why wouldn't I do it? You're telling me I'm going to add more value to this player by just getting at bats for him in the month of April? Like, why wouldn't I do that? And then if I'm the Mets or whomever, I want that guy on my team, not just because he's a pitcher who can help my team, but because of the cap of 13 pitchers. Eventually, Major League Baseball will see this and say, all right, we got to respond. We have to change the rule. I don't know how they would, but they have to think about it. I think that is a brilliant idea by Lorenzen's agent. I think it's completely worth it for a small market team to do it. And then if I'm the Mets and we're sitting here in late July and the Mets are running this 6-man rotation and they're trying to battle everything we just described, why wouldn't you trade for Michael Lorenzen? That would be a no-brainer. So I think it makes a lot of sense. And I was even thinking, does it make sense for the Mets to sign him? Where the Mets sign Michael Lorenzen. I mean, why not? Another swing arm, right? He fits pretty much what they're doing. Maybe they can get the best out of him, pitch out of the bullpen, start. Like, he's perfect. And then in April, try to get him the at-bats. How much would that drive us nuts, though? Because the Mets are trying to win games. So they're down 5-4 against the A's on a Friday night, and we're forced to watch Michael Lorenzen get a few plate appearances. It would be a little frustrating. But you know what? It would save the Mets from trading prospects away. Think about it that way. So I have thought about, hey, should the Mets just be the ones to do it to save them from having to give up, what it's going to cost to get them? But keep an eye on that. That is a very, very interesting thing that the New York Mets and other teams can take advantage of. That's for sure. All right, let me get to one more email, and then we will reveal how we are going to find out what our Rico rewatch is for the 2024 into 2025 year. This is an email from Jackson. Jackson writes, Evan, At this point, I've given up hope that you'll ever come around to the fact that you're wrong about Pete Alonso's value. I wish you weren't so condescending about it, saying anyone who thinks he's a bad defender just doesn't watch the games, bro. But whatever. But while I've given up hope you'll come around on Alonso, I'm hoping I can convince you Luis Castillo is absolutely not as valuable as most of us think he is. My reason for thinking that is pretty simple. We don't talk enough about how T-Mobile Park is basically the pitching equivalence of Coors Field. According to Baseball Savant, Coors Field has a park factor of 112, meaning offense is boosted by 12% in Colorado. This is far and away number one, with second place being Fenway Park at 107. Meanwhile, T-Mobile Park has a park factor of 91, aka 9% below league average for offense. The next closest is Tropicana Field at 96. In other words, T-Mobile Park is head and shoulders above the rest of the league as a pitcher's paradise. The numbers bear out for Castillo. In 2023, his first full year in Seattle, Castillo had a home ERA of 3.09 and a road ERA of 3.62. His OPS against was over 100 points higher on the road, and his whip, K per 9, K to walk ratios were all significantly worse away from Seattle as well. This past season was even worse. Home ERA of 3.15 and a road ERA of 4.25. And again, his OPS against was more than 100 points higher on the road, and his whip, Ks per 9, Ks per walks rate were all significantly worse away from Seattle. At this point, I'm convinced that the Mariners' elite pitching staff is largely a product of getting to pitch at reverse course fields half the time. I think Castillo can still provide value, just not nearly as much as we all think. For what it would cost to get him, I would stay far away, Jackson. The Alonso thing. I'll be condescending again. He is not a butcher at first base. Now, I have never said he's a Gold Glover. I don't think I've ever said that. I've merely said I think he has a reputation that doesn't fit what he is. If you take the individual skills that a first baseman has defensively and you kind of piece them apart, his scooping ability is as good as anybody. That's not all of playing first base, but that's a big part of it. How many errors does Pete Alonso save on bad throws by some of his infield defense? A lot. And as geeky as I am with my scorecards, if Pete's back, I'm going to start tracking how many errors he saves from some of his middle infielders. His throwing ability is atrocious. I agree. Ground ball to first base. They're trying to turn a 3-6-3 double play. I close my eyes. So he is not perfect. Completing the old spring training play, again, not perfect. Does he have the greatest range in the world? No. I think he's an average to slightly above average defensive first baseman. The metrics can say what they want. I watch every game. You watch every game. If we see things differently, then it's one of those horrible moments where we just have to agree to disagree. As far as Castillo is concerned, it's a great point. And it's a great factor. But I'll tell you why he's still worth it. Number one, Luis Castillo's home stadium prior to going to Seattle, where he also had success, was Cincinnati. Great American Ballpark is not quite Coors Field, but it is top 3 in terms of being a hitting-friendly ballpark. So he has already proven that even when his home stadium is not an advantage to him, he can be successful. That's number one. Number two, you brought up the numbers. If you given me a high 3 ERA, but you're going to give me 180 innings, which he gives you every year, and oh, by the way, Citi Field is not a bad pitcher's park. I think it's got more of a reputation as a pitcher's park than maybe it deserves. And it's not T-Mobile Park, but it's not like he's going back to Cincinnati. It's not like he's going to Colorado. I think he would be able to take advantage of it. So if he's giving me a high 3 ERA or a mid 3 ERA, but he's giving me those innings, that is still the value I'm looking for. I said earlier, a lot of people want an ace. Of course, I'd love an ace. Right now, there aren't many aces out there in Major League Baseball. Like, what is the list of total aces in this sport? So an ace may seem unreasonable. That's the appeal of Sasaki, that he can be an ace. Castillo gives me closer to certainty than most other arms. And that's where his value is. And as far as how much it's going to cost, it costs a lot to get pitching. And if you don't want to give up the prospects, then hand out the years. It's like a Sophie's Choice if you're David Stearns. If you don't want to give up the prospects for Luis Castillo, who's on a reasonable contract, if you don't want to give up the prospects for Dylan Cease, who has 1 year left on his deal, or Jesus Luzardo before he went to Philadelphia, then just buy a pitcher. by Corbin Burns. But they're not going to do that. As far as the Rico rewatch is concerned, we have narrowed it down to 4 games, 4 eclectic games in which, and it's up to you, we're not forcing anybody, but we will spend the next few weeks, whenever you have time, rewatching one of these games on YouTube, and then we'll do an entire episode breaking that game down. The 4 games we decided to kind of make as the choices, all games that are in the regular season, by the way. Mets Cardinals, October 1st, 1985. That is a game that is famous for the Darryl Strawberry clock tower shot. It was an old-time pitching duel classic at the end of the regular season as the Mets were battling to win the division in 1985. That is on YouTube. If we select that game, link will be provided. Game number 2, we have October 3rd, 1999. Game 162 between the New York Mets and the Pittsburgh Pirates. That was a game where the Mets needed to win to keep their season going. We weren't sure where we were going, but we knew if we won, there'd be another game. Spoiler alert, there was another game. They went to Cincinnati. Ricky Henderson was a part of that. And the Mets won, advanced, got to the NLCS. So game number 2, another end of regular season classic, October 3rd, 1999, Mets Pirates. Game number 3, we go back to 1985. Opening day. You know, we're all imagining Juan Soto on opening day. How about Gary Carter hitting a walk-off home run on opening day, April 9th, 1985? That's option number 3. And the 4th option, to honor David Wright, May 19th, 2006, David Wright gets the game-winning hit against Mariano Rivera and the New York Yankees. So, how are we going to choose one of these 4 games? Well, I'm glad you asked. One of our emailers, a guy by the name of Brian Webster, wrote an email the other day, and he came up with the idea that makes the most sense. Because in the past, I've said, hey, let's just have a poll on Twitter. Well, the problem with the poll on Twitter is we get these Yankee fans and these non-Ricoers voting in the poll. That's like having an American election and opening up the elections to the entire world. We wouldn't do that. So I threw that one out there. Then I was like, all right, email us, thericob@gmail.com, or lay us a comment when you download the podcast. Here's the problem with that. If I do that, I will be accused of corruption. There's no proof on who emailed the game the most. It'll almost be like, Evan was being selfish and he picked the game. So Brian Webster's idea was this. I'll read you his entire email. Evan and Pete, love the pod. It helps me get through my commute to and from work. And the last few months, it's been aiding and keeping me awake during my late night and early morning feedings with my newborn infant son, waiting for him to fall back into deep enough sleep to be put down to bed. Yeah, we all know, or at least a lot of us know how that feels, Brian. Anyway, I thought I'd throw out my suggestion as how to decide on the random Rico rewatch. And what better way to choose a random game than completely randomly? I say throw all the suggested games, or at least all the suggestions you like, into a hat, and whichever one you pull out is the Rico random rewatch. Thanks for your time. Keep up the great work. Well, I'm glad you said that, Brian. For our YouTube listeners or watchers, I am holding a hat. Okay? If you're listening on the podcast, just trust it. There's a video. You know I'm not lying. In this hat are the 4 games. All right? I'm going to pull one of them out, and that's the Rico rewatch game. Look, here's what's beautiful about this. If you don't want to watch the Rico rewatch game, don't watch it. You can still listen to the podcast. We will still break down the game. Maybe it'll be informative for you if you've never seen it. To me, 2 of these games I've never seen. The 2 games from 1985, I was less than 2 years old. So it would be a first watch for me. The game in 1999 against the Pirates, I was in the building for. I had my own scorecard. The game against the Yankees in 06, believe it or not, I didn't score. One of the rare games I did not score because I was working at Sirius and I was doing nights. And I think I got it spoiled because I walked past like the SNY studios and it was up on a screen. So that would be almost a first watch for me too, in a weird way. But here we go. You guys ready? I'm holding up the hat, putting my hand in. I'm trying to pull one out. Let's see what I got. All right. I have it. I pulled 2 out. I got to put it back. Ladies and gentlemen, I have the answer. We will be watching Gary Carter's opening day home run from 1985. It's ripped up. You can't see it. It says, trust me, it says OD 1985. So congratulations. We are going all the way back to April of 1985 to watch the late, great Gary Carter win a game for the New York Mets against the St. Louis Cardinals. That'll be fun. Is that a fair selection? You know what I'm laughing about? I should show you. The way I wrote these down on papers, like this one is David Wright. It's way too fat. This one was the opening day. It looks like the state of Tennessee. This one was 1999. It got ripped up where all you see is 9-9. And then the last one was that game in October of 1985. So, yeah, my ripping of the papers was not good. I should have used a scissor. But here's what I will tell the Rico audience. If you enjoy this, if this is a fun exercise, we can do another one. We can do 2 during this offseason. I'm not against it. I'm probably going to watch all of them anyway. I'm going away. My kids are going to be playing. I'm going to need something to watch. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, we will supply a link to this game, but the game we are going to rewatch or watch for the first time, depending on your age, is opening day 1985, April 5th or April 9th. I'm sorry. I forget the exact date. Either way, the link will be there. Mets Cardinals opening day. It ends dramatically, but maybe you don't know how we got there. How did we get to the point where Gary Carter was hitting a game-winning home run? I think that'll be a fun selection, and honestly, I think all of them are fun. I think what makes that one really cool to me is that the Gary Carter acquisition was like, in a way, the Juan Soto acquisition for us. You know, I hear what my dad's reaction to that trade was, what Beningo's reaction to that trade was. It was stunning. It was exciting. It was amazing. Obviously, these are guys at different points in their career, but Gary Carter's a Hall of Famer. And when you look at that 86 team, and this is maybe a discussion for that pod as well, Doc Gooden and Darryl Strawberry have their numbers retired. Keith Hernandez has his number retired. With all due respect to those 3 gentlemen, they're not in the Hall of Fame. Gary Carter does not have his number retired. He is in the Hall of Fame. And this was his initial moment as a New York Met. So for anyone who's a Gary Carter guy, for anyone who never saw this opening day could almost be like our encouragement of maybe what we're going to see this opening day with Juan Soto. So it should be a lot of fun. We will have that episode sometime in late January, so we'll give you guys time to watch it. If you do it over the holidays, great. If you don't, anytime you're free, anytime you're bored, you can do it in pieces as well. You don't have to sit down and watch a 3-hour baseball game from 40 years ago. Pick a time where you're free. That's the other thing. It's the 40th anniversary of that game. Didn't even think about that. So I think the hat gave us a very good selection. Opening day Mets Cardinals, 1985. Coming up on this Rico Brogna, this channel, whether it's the Rico Brogna you download, whether it's on the WFAN YouTube page, we have a 3-part series coming out during Christmas week. It's going to debut on Wednesday night, and it should be available to download Wednesday as well. A 3-part countdown of the greatest home runs in the history of the New York Mets. Part number 1 will be honorable mention. Part number 2 will be numbers 20 through 11. And then part number 3, which is going to debut a week from today, Sunday, will be the top 10 home runs in the history of the New York Mets. So it will be a fun walk down memory lane. Pete did a great job. We have the audio from every home run call, so it's not just me saying it. You'll get to hear it. And some of these calls are just freaking legendary. So a 3-part special throughout Christmas week. Part 1 will debut on Wednesday. Part 2 will debut on Friday. And the finale will debut on Sunday. 3-parter with the greatest home runs in Met history. Obviously, if there's any breaking Met news, there may be a Rico squeezed in between there. Assuming something big happens. You never know. Maybe Pete Alonso comes home. Either way, we appreciate you listening and subscribing. Remember to download the Rico Brogna wherever you download your podcast. You can always email us to ricob@gmail.com, ricob@gmail.com. Have a great holiday, and thanks for listening to Rico Brogna.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Rico Brogna podcast. It's amazing, isn't it? Make sure you download it now to keep it on you at all times.